Niall Reddy was meant to be on tomorrow's panel, but we felt that we should bring him forward. We were going to bring him and Natalia forward, but Natalia has another commitment this afternoon. So Niall will talk about Towards a Party of a New Kind. And we have his paper. I hope everybody read it. And he's just stepping into the room now, and we're going to hand over to him. So now you have about 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, comrade. So firstly, I have to apologize because I was doing this last minute thing where I was going to wake up early in the morning and to prepare my remarks, which I obviously can't do now. And I don't want to just read the paper to you, so I'm rather just going to talk a bit off the cuff here. It'll probably come out a little bit scattered, but hopefully some of you have had a chance to read the paper and at least give us just a foundation for the discussion. I was going to say at the start that I'm going to try in a sense, in a way that I also kind of did in the paper, to formulate some of the things I'm going to say in quite stark terms, without touching on the nuances that I think exist there, because I do want to use these remarks to try and spark strategic debate. And then I hope in the course of the discussion we can uncover and go back to some of those nuances that I might be skipping over. So I realize that the title that I gave the paper and that I gave this talk is in some ways a bit of an odd title for it. The title is something like Towards a Party of a New Kind. But what I actually end up describing is very much actually a party of an old kind. In fact, in a certain sense, it's a party of the oldest kind, because the things I described there have a fundamental resemblance to socialism of the Second International, the Kautsky's period, and indeed bear a strong resemblance to social democracy of the 20th century. That it's in a certain way, what I'm arguing is that a new party has to take certain foundations from the social democratic experience. Now, why is it? The basic reason for this is that I think the only other viable alternative to a democratic road to socialism, which is to say insurrectionist one, Leninist model of various kinds, has now, I think, been shown to be entirely inappropriate for industrialized liberal democracies. Leninism, of course, got wrong this expectation that there was going to be some kind of breakdown moment of capitalism. That breakdown never came. It turned out to be economically a lot more stable than they predicted. But even worse than this, Leninism never really found a way of accumulating power and building the coalition that it needed to under conditions of capitalist stability that would have prepared it for that ruptural moment. And the reason that it failed, I think, to do this is that it fundamentally failed to take seriously the deeply embedded legitimacy of industrialized capitalist states in liberal democracies and the depth of the aversion toward revolution that this created in the working classes in general. It was only ever an insignificant segment of the working class that was interested in revolution or that could imagine revolution in the terms that Leninism taught. So what this means then is that I think basically the parameters for socialist strategy today have to be one of trying to go beyond social democracy. What I'm advocating here is not that social democracy provides some kind of blueprint, some kind of formula for us to follow. But what I am saying is that I think fundamentally our starting point has to be seeking in various ways to replicate the successes of social democracy, success in constructing the coalition that it needs to, and coming to power in settings that would have been that are very adverse to other kinds of socialist strategy. And then finding new ways to overcome the dilemmas that ultimately brought it down. So we have to replicate a part of the model, but ultimately we have to build something that's very different. But I think that to a large extent, the burden of innovation on us has more to do with the question of how to wield power and how to deal with the contradictions of being in power than it does with the question of how to assume power. The question of how to assume power, I think in its broad terms, there's a hell of a lot to learn from social democracy. These can form foundations of the political project that we need to build. So what are those foundations? Well, I'm going to talk about 2 to 3 main things. The first is that I think any new socialist party that we construct in South Africa has to have a fairly uninhibited embrace of electoral competition. It has to see electoral competition as critical to its basic functioning. It has to see electoral competition as one of the main instruments that it has in carrying out the task of class formation, carrying out the basic function of what a political party should do, trying to articulate the interests of workers, connecting them to the socialist project. Now, why is this the case? This, I think, follows almost directly from the premise about the strength of the legitimacy of the state in industrialized democracies. As soon as we accept that that is the most obvious fact, essentially, about the working class for the last 100 years, is that it's been very hard to wean them off that legitimacy. It means that inevitably, for us to make any ground, we have to participate in, compete in those institutions that are invested with that legitimacy. Because it means that if the working class sees no alternative to this, if it doesn't believe in revolution, it doesn't matter how odious it might regard those institutions, it doesn't matter how much it might regard mainstream politics as a rigged system, it's still going to see that as a legitimate arena in which power is decided. And if we are to achieve the fundamental thing that we have to do as socialists, which is to make people believe that the kind of transformation we're talking about is possible, then we have to compete in those arenas. Right? They are invested with a legitimacy that we cannot go around. Okay. So we have to be prepared for electoral competition. We have to see electoral competition as a fundamental instrument by which we try to organize a class, why we try to project our message of socialism and alter and articulate consciousness. But even more fundamentally than this, it's obvious that if we've given up on an insurrectionary path, then we have to compete in elections, because ultimately this is the only way that we are going to assume institutional power and to be able to affect the much more fundamental reforms that don't just repair the system, but take us in the direction of socialism, the kind that Mario was talking about. So we have to compete in elections, not just as a tool for class formation, but because this is what it means to embrace a democratic road to power. Fundamentally, our strategy is assuming power by legal means, and then finding ways to use that power in the service of a long-term agenda for social. So what does that mean? It means firstly that we have to develop a program that is suited to this political project, which means that it has to be a program in the sense of governance, right? We have to move very far away from the model of what Trotskyists call minimum demands. Minimum demands were raise a set of demands that you know full well the system cannot accommodate. And what you're trying to do with that is essentially nurture the contradictions of the system. So the system cannot react to that demand and it just slips from one unstable moment to the next. We have to think about something very different. We have to think about what Andre Gause and various other people have called non-reformist reforms. So these are reforms that ultimately undercut capitalist power. Reforms that what fundamentally distinguishes them is that they try to shift power in the favor of the working class. But we have to see this, I think, as something of a very long-term agenda. So it's not just reforms that immediately put the working class on a footing that it can now start creating Soviets and whatever. But reforms that fundamentally, I think, working in two different fields, trying to restructure the economy and then ultimately trying to restructure and democratize the state, are things that in the long term expand the capacity of the working class while constantly shrinking the prerogatives that capital has over various elements of our society. So the framework has to be non-reformist reform. I'm not going to, in this talk, say anything about exactly what those are. I think, again, a lot of the elements of this program can be inspired by traditional social democracy. It has to be a big component of essentially welfare demands. We have to create social supports. We have to use public policy to deliver public goods to people and try to use that to construct a coalition. But just one thing that I think, just to highlight part of the task, I think, for us as South African socialists and trying to imagine this kind of program is that fundamentally, I think it has to have elements of it that are developmentalist. So part of what the task is, if we're thinking about the kinds of structural changes that will ultimately benefit the working class, one of the things that we have to confront is finding ways to reindustrialize the economy. Right? We all know that if there's a fundamental structural reason why the left has been losing ground for 40 years, it is the winnowing of the class of traditional class basis of social democracy. It is deindustrialization cutting down what used to be the natural ground for socialism. And we have to find ways, I think, of reversing that. And I think there's two historical examples that we can draw a lot on in trying to imagine that program. The first is the Swedish example. We often think of European social democracy as operating in a context that's totally alien to us, but we must remember that Scandinavian social democracy came about in the 1930s, when these were totally underdeveloped and agrarian societies. And part of what was so successful about Scandinavian social democracy and differentiated itself from social democracy on the continent was that they did find ways they found essentially economic policies that were actually very effective at creating a relatively competitive economy, but not doing so on terms that favor capitalists, that actually allow for a slow progressive empowerment of their own working class base. So I think that's one place to look. The reality, though, is that the challenges of development are very different in the 21st century in the context that we're operating in. And so we have to look at the few examples in the world where there have been successful developmental projects, and that really is the East Asian developmental states. And I think we have to find ways of being inspired by that project, but reformulating it in a way that ultimately what we're constructing is a labor-driven developmental state, for which we should acknowledge there is no historical precedent. This is something that is our task, I think, to imagine. But there are certain things that those states undertook, certain ways of orchestrating accumulation, and using industrial policy in very effective ways that I think we have no choice but to consider. Okay, so this is one platform that I think a new left party has to take seriously. It has to be a party that's prepared to compete in the institutions of liberal democracy, and has to have serious electoral game. The second thing that I think we need, and again, this is in many ways inspired by the long history of the left all over the world, is that we have to find ways of reimplanting ourselves in a very deep way in the working class, and particularly in the organized working class. And I'm using that term now in a slightly narrower version. I don't mean just blue-collar workers, I mean the large segment of white-collar workers, but I do mean formally people employed in the formal economy. We have to go back. Now, why? Again, this is something that was, I think, basically an article of faith for left strategy for the first 100 years of the socialist movement. The reason I think it bears repeating and emphasizing now is because it was, to some extent, lost to the repertoire of the left under decades of what we could broadly call movementism, that went beyond, that I think wasn't just about taking advantage of numerous exciting new social movements that emerged in the last few decades, but drew more extreme strategic conclusions from that by way of trying to look for political subjects totally outside of what had been the traditional base of socialism, and of trying to formulate social strategy in a way that ultimately ended up excluding the working class. And I think the experience now shows us that that is not viable. The working class, the organized working class, has to be, again, at the center of the left's political project. And the theoretical reasons for that are the same as the ones that informed socialists operating in the earliest years of socialism. That this is where structural power lies. There is no other sector in society that has the capacity the organized working class does, because there is no other sector in society that can shut off the flow of profit. And nothing is going to replace it. And I think this is why the record shows that all of the great breakthroughs that we've made in terms of constructive welfare states, in terms of really challenging capitalist power, have come when it is organized workers at the center of that. The other thing about it is that I think the recent history of this country also goes to show that trade unions have been much more stable basis for forming the movement foundations of the Socialist Party than have social movements. In many ways, South Africa was a country that was relatively fertile ground for the social movements. As Michelle has talked about a number of times, I think it's a legacy of our past. We had a relatively mobilized civil society, and it's why we were a site in which you saw numerous pretty successful examples of socialist movements that became international inspirations. But the reality is that those movements, if we're going to take the alphabet balance sheet now, did not get anywhere close to the kind of breakthroughs that we need if we're going to be serious about socialism as a transformative vision. And most of them are ultimately defeated, rolled back, and then today I think we would agree, a lot of them, the ones that initially inspired people are on their last legs or have ceased to exist. Whereas the trade unions, for everything that they've gone through, remain mass formation. There are still millions of people organized in trade unions that have considerable resources in this country. And I think it's a critical task for socialists to find ways of trying to revitalize those unions and once again make them vehicles for a socialist project. And I think it's one of the reasons why this discussion that we're having is so critical right now, because it's quite possible that what we're facing is a relatively narrow window in which, if we don't find ways of overcoming the decline of the rots in our unions, it might be that we're finding ourselves in a position of what US socialists are in now, where it's not just trying to revitalize and reorient the union movement, it's trying to rebuild it from the ground up in various adverse conditions. And that would be a historical disaster for us. So we need to act very quickly on this goal. And I think it's one reason why our party is so critical. And I think one just broad thing that should inform how we go about this is that it has to involve a shift away from mobilization towards deep organization. This has come up a few times in the conversation today. Michelle was mentioning a few times about this kind of predilection for protest being the automatic reaction on the left. We need to get away, I think, from being totally informed by this framework, either protests or these campaigns that we believe are going to suddenly stitch together this coalition. We have to really confront the fact that revitalizing these union movements means going back and doing the hard, long slog of deep organizing, right? Of building deep structures rather than assuming we can just mobilize people into the movements that we need. Komichi, how much time do I have? Great. So then maybe just one other thing on this question of how to relate to the union movement is that I think one other thing is that we have to overcome something that's become a tendency on the South African left to be extremely critical of white-collar unions, in particular public sector unions, and to see them as very hostile ground for socialism, see them in some way structurally or congenitally conservative, and therefore not something that we should be appealing to. Now, obviously, that position is informed by a certain reality. These are unions that have been much more integrated into the ANC, and they have been much more hostile to any kind of left politics outside of the ANC. But the reality of the transformation in the class structure that we've seen in this country means that there's no viable mass base for our political project that doesn't have at the center of it a whole set of white-collar and public sector unions. So we need to not in any way write them out of the equation. And I think that we will see in the relatively near period in this conjunction that there are openings that will emerge because of this fiscal crisis that we're seeing. And I think major divisions that we're going to start seeing fracturing the ANC. And so we need to see that as part of our orientation, is relating to public sector unions. Okay, so I'll just say a few quick things on the last point. And this is another place where I think we have to really go beyond social democracy. And it's one of the areas where I think we have to do things fundamentally different, is that we just have to build a political party that is more democratic than anything that we're used to in this country. So firstly, we have to firmly dispense with democratic centralism as defined by traditional leftist parties, as defined as a principal feature of the organizational structure. This was a very constrained notion of democracy. It was a certain period of deliberation, and then you effectively hand control over the leadership of the party to direct it towards these goals, but you give considerable powers to thereafter control the debate. And we just cannot entertain it. That was a model that was developed to be effective in traditional czarist authoritarianism. It might be useful in that context, but it's not useful for the kind of transformation that we have to imagine. Because fundamentally, if we are going to go beyond social democracy, facing up to the challenges that broke social democracy, there's no other way around it than building more democratic movements. Those central challenges are bureaucratization and incorporation into the party state, and all of the dynamics that we're even seeing in more recent experiences, as what was his name? Mario was just discussing, about how we realize that strategically there's no way for us to develop without seizing national power and institutional government. But in every instance that we've done that, the problem of how to make that element of the party continue to be accountable to its base and to movements has really broken us. And there's broadly the framework for how we address this is we have to create a more vibrant democracy in our movements that finds a way of holding them accountable. I think there's things about democratic centralism we want to hold on to, right? The basic idea that we try to decide things collectively and that we try to act in one way is a sound, right? We need a party that's the basis of how we're ever going to be effective. We have to deliberate on what's the right strategy, and we all have to work together to carry out that strategy. That's what democratic centralism is trying to do. But we have to promote this as a political culture in the organization, right? Rather than handing over instruments of power to a leadership to enforce that. It has to be based on trying to get people, trying to mobilize them normatively, essentially, trying to get them to embrace a principle of this thing without coercing them into it. So again, I don't have the answer of exactly how we do this. Part of it is about new organizational forms, and as I was saying to Vish just now, I think one of the things that's going to make our life a bit easier is that this whole experience of new left parties that's occurred in the West recently, I think, provides us with a wealth of experience and examples that we can draw on trying to design new democratic structures. But for us in South Africa, there is, I think, a more entrenched challenge, which is that it's not just about, coming up with new clever ways of doing things, but it's about confronting a very deeply rooted anti-democratic bent that's deeply implanted in the South African political culture of the left as a direct result of long legacies of Stalin. So what we have to do is it's going to be, it's not simply an organizational project, but it's almost a kind of cultural project. And the way to address that, I think, there's nothing else but deep, serious, rigorous political education and ideological work to try and address these things and overcome them. So I think I will leave it there. Thanks, man.